We're looking today at the origins of American landscape photography in the mid 1800s. Let's start by looking at two key images from this period in American landscape photography. So on the left, you see a photograph by Timothy O'Sullivan from Nevada in 1867. On the right, you see a photograph by Carlton Watkins from around the same period of time, 1865, 1866. So the dimensions are slightly different. They're shown on the screen on the screen at the same size, but in real life, you can see the Timothy O'Sullivan image is somewhat smaller. Carlton Watkins is a little larger, but that's not the only difference between the two. They tell really different stories about what the American West is like. And the reasons that they look different, the reasons that they look the way that they do, are what we want to get into today. Let's start by talking about painting because the conventions of building landscape photographs are descendants of the principles that were used for building paintings. We're going to consider two different traditions in landscape painting, the picturesque and the sublime. Let's start by looking at the picturesque. So this is a painting by John Constable, who's considered to be the most significant landscape painter in the English tradition. And this is typical of the kind of paintings that he was making and was very, very revered for in the early 19th century. So this is called the Haywain. It's from 1821. And what you're seeing is a picture of the English countryside, rural place that could be used for agriculture or for milling. It shows evidence of human habitation. Okay, you see a house on the left, you see a wagon sort of going through a stream, you see some people, some horses. It looks quaint, it looks charming, it looks welcoming, and it looks timeless. And those are conventions of picturesque landscape painting. So when we're looking at picturesque landscape, these conventions go back to the Baroque. Okay, they are conventions that have been in place for a couple hundred years, but they were particularly popular in Constable's time, which happens to be the time of the rise of photography. So these are the qualities of a picturesque landscape painting. They have qualities of feeling comforting, uplifting in mood. There's a sense of flourishing that elements of nature, your trees and grass and animals and life can flourish there. And they feel timeless. They feel like they could have been glimpsed at any time in the present or in the past. There's a feeling of timelessness in these paintings. Compositionally speaking, there's a clear sense of foreground, middle ground, and background in these paintings. And again, this is a convention that goes back to the 16th century. Compositionally, there are framing devices that make the viewer of the painting feel like they know where they stand. They make you as a viewer feel grounded, and everything in front of you seems to be stable and to visually make sense from from a vantage point where the viewer is. There seem to be hiding places out there in the landscape. It looks like if you walked into this landscape, there would be places for you to rest where you would feel safe. So these are all qualities of a picturesque landscape painting of the kind that Constable was the reigning master of. Overall, the picturesque landscape confirms the status quo. It feels reassuring, and the style of landscape painting remains popular to this day. What does that have to do with photography? Have a look at this photograph by Roger Fenton, which we actually saw in one of our class presentations a few days ago. So this is typical of Roger Fenton's approach to landscape photography. Roger Fenton was a well-educated person. He knew well the conventions of landscape painting, which appealed to his English audience. Okay, so he's appealing to the wealthy, educated, upper class British consumers of photography. So the sensibilities that build those picturesque paintings are the same sensibilities that he's using to construct a landscape photograph. Foreground, middle ground, and background, a sense of flourishing. Human habitation is there and seems completely harmonious with the landscape, and everything feels timeless. So this is the English tradition, the picturesque tradition. Let's move on to consider the sublime tradition in the landscape. So, when we're talking about the sublime, we're talking in painting about a way of thinking about painting that finds evidence of the divine in the landscape. In the sublime, in the aesthetic of the sublime, you hear talk of the sublime and the beautiful. And the sublime and the beautiful are partner components in the aesthetic of the sublime. They're related ways of experiencing divine presence in the natural world. This tradition of seeking the sublime in painting has its partners in music and in literature and in other forms of expression in romanticism. But sticking just with visual expression here, when we're talking about the sublime, we're talking about qualities that are awe-inspiring and threatening and vast. So in the sublime, you have a sense that humanity is small, nature is vast. And in the landscape, that is presented to us in the forms of storms, mountains, calamity, things that make the human being feel small. There are elements of balance against the sublime that you see that are described as the beautiful with a capital B. And those are calming, peaceful, uplifting elements. Those make humanity feel like they're part of a harmonious whole, and there are sunrises or peaceful scenes or flowers coming up in the spring. So the aesthetic of the sublime balances the sublime, where it's powerful and awe-inspiring, and the beautiful, where it's peaceful and calming. And sometimes it leans more towards one, and sometimes it leans more towards the other. The sublime tradition in landscape painting traces back to the Germans, and this is an example of the German approach to the sublime landscape, where you see the man standing on a rocky outcropping, looking out at this vast landscape that just seems to go on forever and ever, and it's filled with mystery and it's filled with the unknown. So this is the wanderer above the mists, and it's sort of the icon of sublime painting. When it comes to American landscape painting, in American identity, we as Americans have always strongly identified with the landscape as integral to who we are as a country. We see our expression of being American in this landscape. And in the 19th century, they're looking westward. Westward from where? Basically, westward from the East Coast, and sort of and from the landscape that's typical of the 13 original colonies. So at this point in the 1850s, they're looking at the Niagara Falls in particular as a sort of a gateway between the landscape that is familiar to them in the eastern part of the United States and the landscape that is further west, where they have yet to conquer, dominate, and make the land their own. So when you see paintings of Niagara Falls, know that it's not just about the vastness of the actual place, but it's about everything that it represents. It represents the opening to all of the vastness of the landscape that goes ever further west from there. With the beginnings of photography in America, the technology of the daguerreotype comes to America at a time that in American identity they're looking westward, and the Niagara Falls is sort of emblematic of that transition point between the established America in the east and everything that is west that they're starting to figure out how to make their own. So you see these daguerreotypes of Niagara Falls that have that feeling of the sublime, because that sublime quality where there is a sense of vastness and threaten and overwhelm, that's what they see Niagara Falls representing, and they capture that in the daguerreotype image. In addition to capturing it in the form of this sense of the sublime in the visual image, they also want to sell it. There is commerce involved in all of that too. So there were daguerreotype studios set up at Niagara Falls that would capture daguerreotypes and then sell them, and they were pretty pricey. But there were people who wanted this and would pay a lot of money to be able to take a visual record of the Niagara Falls home with them in daguerreotype form. Here's a close-up where you can see some of the sharp detail that's captured there. So as a whole, they can only capture a little bit of a frame at a time, but it's getting a sense of the vastness and overwhelm that you feel from Niagara Falls. As time passes, they're able to capture these landscapes in negatives and then make prints from them. And you see these human beings in there that gives you a sense of scale and a sense of the vastness of the whole thing because you sort of like feel like you know how big everything is. But back to painting. The sense of the sublime in painting is very important in landscape painting of this time. So Americans are thinking of the world out west, the world that's beyond the eastern part of the United States and the landscape that's familiar to them. And they want these paintings that feel dramatic and powerful and overwhelming, but also give them that sense of the beautiful, sense of elements that make humanity feel like they have their place. And they have entrance points. They have that foreground, middle ground, and background that visually give you a sense that there's a place to walk into in the image. American audiences also enjoyed allegorical landscapes like this one by Thomas Cole. And in this view, you're looking down from a mountain down towards an agricultural landscape on the right-hand side where the land has been divided out into farms. There are houses with smoke rising from the chimneys. And then on the left, you see a storm. It's a very powerful thunderstorm, and it's sort of moving off to the left. On the right is where it has cleared away. So this, at the time that this painting is made in the early 19th century, people are moving in, Americans who are based in the eastern side of the country are imagining their nation as expanding westward and following this course of manifest destiny, moving westward and claiming all that land as their own. So that movement from the east to the west on a map goes from the right to the left, and that's the direction of movement that you see in this painting. This painting would have represented to its original audience the sense that there's threat and there are things to be afraid of. There's danger over there on the left, where towards the unknown. And yet that danger is going to clear, and when that is all over, things will be calm and things will be settled. It's a painting that has layers to it, so it tells a story that seems pretty simple at first, but when you look at what people have actually done to that landscape, it's kind of interesting. But this represents people's feelings about westward expansion and their conquest of the natural world, moving out towards the west. Americans also liked collecting allegorical landscapes like this one, even more heavy-handed. This is from a little bit later. This is in the 1870s, after the Civil War, when they are moving westward in greater and greater numbers and taking telegraph wires along with them as they go. So the trains are moving out there and the covered wagons are moving out there. And there's this sort of personified goddess of the telegraph who's extending telegraph wire out there to the west too.